Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 7, where we will explore the topic of depth psychology, theology, and sacred. And in order to do that, I wanted to first do a little bit of Theology 101 here. So what is theology? For many of you, this might not be a given. So theology actually comes from two Greek words, theos and logos, which literally translates as God talk. So it's words, logos, about God, theos. And what we see when we look at the history of Western, at least Christian theology, is that there are two major trends that are actually quite pre-Christian. And that is rooted in Platonic and Aristotelian influence. Another important background piece here is that at some point in history, in probably definitely prior to late antiquity, so prior to the 3rd through 6th century, Aristotle was actually lost. His works were actually lost and were only later discovered in the 11th century by the Arabic scholar Avicenna. And it's through Avicenna that Aristotle gets retranslated from the Arabic into Latin, originally in the Greek, if you're following me, and then becomes infused into medieval Western culture. So for a period of about 1,000 years, Aristotle is lost to not just the Western world, but really to the philosophical world. So what ends up happening is that the Platonic influence through Plato, but also through Neoplatonists, for example, Plotinus, the Platonic influence is very strong, and what actually is the foundation upon which early Christian theologians built their metaphysics, their epistemology, their ontologies were all upon the foundation of Platonic or Neoplatonic Greek thinking. And we see this both in the Latin West with figures, for example, St. Augustine. If you've read his Confessions or if you've read his City of God, the Confessions especially, actually he's very explicit about his own Neoplatonic influences. And then in the Greek Eastern Church with the so-called Cappadocian Fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Basil the Great, who are sort of the three founding figures of Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Byzantine Christian theology. Their scaffolding is almost entirely Platonic or Neoplatonic, to be more specific. And what that means briefly and generally is this notion of the soul, the soul, the pre-existence of the soul, the fact that a soul is incarnated. They did away with the reincarnation piece that the Platonists and the Neoplatonists subscribe to, but the idea of a unique individual personal soul that descends from the monad, and then returns to the one after death. So it's this process of descent of the soul and the return and the reunification of the soul. It is very much a mystical theology or a mystical philosophy. Now, this is also picked up in a very interesting figure, Dionysius the Areopagite, which is a figure from the Acts of the Apostles that St. Paul meets at the Areopagus in, I believe, in Athens. But he was an anonymous 5th, 6th century writer who wrote under the name Dionysius. So that's why he's referred to as pseudo-Dionysius. Now, he was a Greek-speaking or Greek-writing Syriac author, so a Syriac Christian. And what he does is he takes Platonic, Neoplatonic ideas and he infuses it into Christian theology in a very thorough and influential way in a trilogy of works: the divine names, the celestial hierarchy, which really lays out the ordering of the cosmos. So it's his Neoplatonic Christian cosmology. And then his mystical theology, which is stunningly, magnificently apophatic. So in the divine names and in the celestial hierarchy, it is more of a cataphatic theology. It is saying the things that can be known about God. In his mystical theology, he takes more of an apophatic turn. So what does that mean? It means that the only way that we can approach God is through the via negativa, through unsaying God. The only way we can know God is by that which we cannot know about God. So we approach God, we approach the divinity through darkness. This becomes highly influential in both the Greek East and the Latin West, all the way up through John of the Cross, and his very influential idea of the dark night of the soul. So I wanted to give you this basic outline of some of the origins of theology, because you can see that theology in its original inception, prior to the Middle Ages, was considered mystical at its core. A theologian, one who practiced theologia, was understood in a certain sense to be a mystic. Theology, this is something that becomes retained in the Eastern tradition, but it's something that is lost or ultimately split in the medieval Latin Western tradition, where, because of the rediscovery and the infusion of Aristotle in the 11th, 12th century, there's a split that happens between the theology of the schools, for example, the University of Paris. So this is sort of what becomes known as scholastic theology, which is a form of academic theology more as speculative philosophy, versus the more monastic, experiential theology that retains its mystical character and component, with someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, who was the great Cistercian monastic abbot and mystic and scholar. The monastic experiential tradition retains its Neoplatonism through the influence of Augustine, whereas the more scholastic academic tradition, with its infusion of Aristotelian ratio, or reason, starts to split away and focus on more speculative approaches to divinity. Right? This is the type of theology that, at least in the Catholic tradition, becomes inherited all the way up until the 1950s, which is why we're sort of doing this overview here, because Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican priest. Victor White was a neo-Thomistic Dominican priest. So this rational, this Aristotelian emphasis on ratio, on reason, is something that becomes carried through the Catholic tradition, really from the 11th, 12th century all the way up to the middle of the 20th century. Now, I wanted to include Meister Eckhart down here as well, because Eckhart is very interesting. He was also a Dominican, so he was trained in the scholastic methodologies, but he also, through the influence of pseudo-Dionysius, retains the Platonic and the apophatic approach. So Eckhart is a very interesting outlier in this whole schema. And ultimately, as some of you may know, he was considered, his works were considered not full out heretical, but there were a number of problematic issues that he was accused of and ultimately condemned after his death in the early 14th century. So these are some different approaches to theology. And you can see, if you want to look at this through the lens of psychological types, for example, you can see how certain typologies win out over others. And we have the thinking function, in a certain sense, winning out over the intuitive function, at least in the Western tradition. So, as I mentioned, when we travel in time here, flash forward a lot of years, 700 or 800 years, to the 1950s, Catholic theology hasn't really evolved or changed that much. If anything, it just continued to reassert and restate the importance of Thomistic, or what later became neo-Thomistic thought, because there was actually a revival and renewal of interest in Thomas Aquinas in the 1950s. So that's the culture and the milieu that Victor White is emerging out of, particularly as a Dominican who's teaching at Blackfriars College at Oxford. But outside of the Catholic theological world, the post-World War II crisis of secularism mostly elicited a Protestant response. Some of the greatest theologians of that time were people like Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, and in a certain sense, the psychoanalysts were the most, or one of the most influential theologians of the day. For example, Erik Erikson and his study, his psychoanalytic study of Luther, entitled Jung, Man, Luther, and Paul Tillich's inclusion of more existential themes into his systematic theology. So Protestant theology is what is sort of leading the way in its, to quote Parsons, its dialogue with theology and psychology, which developed a new or modern language for religious experience that ultimately led to an entire field of pastoral psychology, which ultimately ended up becoming very influential in Catholic circles as well. Okay, and here's a list of some of the main figures that Parsons mentions. Okay, so Victor White, as I just stated, so relatively, I mean, pretty short life, relatively speaking. British Dominican who spent most of his career at Oxford, begins a friendship with Jung through letter writing, 1945, pretty much up until the late 50s, or actually, that might be wrong, because at a certain point they parted ways, and actually stopped communicating. But it was a very rich and robust correspondence that was recently, I think within the past 10 years, has been published. But ultimately, it was controversy over Jung's answer to Job that led to their split and breaking apart from one another, mostly around the problem of evil. And I don't want to get into this too much here, because this is going to be the focus of next week when we turn to answer to Job. But the main issue, one of the other main issues, was something that we discussed previously with the Palmer, or saw previously with the Palmer book, around the metaphysical reality of the self, and what is the extent of the self, and is the self, for Jung, is the self God? You know, Jung's distinction between the God and the God image. What is the reality of the self at a metaphysical level? Even though Jung stated multiple times that he was an empiricist and he was not interested in metaphysical speculation, he clearly had a belief system that was underlying his notion of the self. I think for Jung, the self was his experience or encounter of God. So Victor White, as a Catholic priest and as a committed theologian, had a difficult time with that one. The other piece is that he took issue with Jung's quote unquote Manichaeanism, or his dualism. The fact that for Jung, the imago, the God image, needed to contain both polarities of light and dark, of good and evil, was also something that Victor White, as a Catholic theologian, could not ascribe to, because he held to the theological notion of the privatio boni, which is the privation of good, that evil is an absence of good. Jung took extreme issue with that, because he thought that it minimized the reality of evil. And of course, Jung is coming out, this is someone who experienced both world wars. So Jung is taking the problem of evil very, very seriously. So these were some of the controversies, some of the issues that ultimately led to their split and sadly, to the end of their friendship. So let's turn to Victor White's writings. Very smart, very sophisticated, very thorough. His historical summary of the unconscious in the chapter "The Unconscious and God" is actually quite extraordinary, and the fact that he can do this in under 10 pages is really quite a feat. So he gives us this wonderful summary from Frederick Myers through Freud and Jung, all the way through the Enlightenment, the Romantics, the German idealists, Eastern philosophy, in only a few paragraphs. I really like what he does though here. How he defines the unconscious. Remember, we were just talking about apophatic theology. Well, White gives us an example of what could be considered apophatic psychology. The unconscious as a postulate known by its effects, a negative concept for what is not conscious. So the unconscious being everything that we are not conscious of, which is a very interesting, again, apophatic statement, defining the unconscious through a via negativa. So here we're really looking at language and translation and parsing out this dialogue between theology and psychology and seeing ways that which they complement but also challenge one another, which he turns more to into the chapter entitled Frontiers of Theology and Psychology. So notice again this emphasis on modern science. This is true to very much, a mid 20th century kind of fascination or obsession. Science and religion, science and theology, faith and reason. So he's trying to create some sort of integration between modern science and theology, and even stating here how psychology as a form of modern science is sort of knocking on the door of theology, and in a certain sense might be either supplanting it or at least maybe pushing its boundaries and horizons. So he gives a nice summary of the postmodern situation, which I don't think has changed much since that time. This is the idea of psychotherapists or the clergy, which is a chapter from Jung's Modern Man in Search of the Soul. Where are people going for spiritual formation? Where are people going to fulfill their religious needs? Oftentimes it's to psychotherapy rather than institutional or formal religion, as many of you are very well aware. He does ask he sort of digs into the basic issues here when Victor White asks, sort of challenging the essay that we read, Jung's essay, Christ, the Symbol of the Self, that we read in the residential. He's challenging that. Is Christ a symbol of the self, or is the self a symbol of Christ? So the issue here is around the relativization, what Jung refers to as the relativization of the God image, because for Victor White, it's not relative. For him, Christ is not a symbol of the self is a symbol of Christ. So he puts the primacy on Christ as an insider, as a theologian, as a believer. Right? So the basic premise here, or the basic conflict, becomes metaphysical. Where does the unconscious end? Where does God begin? What is the place of or for God in psyche, in the unconscious? Right. So to go back to the Tertullian example, the famous Tertullian quote that the soul is naturally Christian, it becomes a question of language and a common ground. Right. There are different hermeneutical and soteriological concerns. The soteriological is a fancy theology word that connects to salvation. So there are different hermeneutical and soteriological concerns between depth psychology and theology. But ultimately, are they different? And for White and for Jung, it was ultimately unreconcilable. And perhaps from an insider theological perspective, it is perhaps ultimately unreconcilable. But are they different concerns? When we get to Corbett's chapter here in the religious function of the psyche, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book, where he entitled A Psychological View of Some Traditional Religious Ideas, what he does here is Corbett engages in the art of psychologizing and also deliteralizing, which involves a relativization of the God image, a relativization of traditional theological categories, but also an interiorizing of them, So we can ask questions, or we can do hermeneutical translation work to talk about, well, what is a sacrament? If we move a sacrament from the external realm of ritual to the internal process of depth psychology, the psyche becomes the locus of revelation, right? Dream work becomes the locus of revelation. So all of a sudden, it democratizes the church experience or any sort of religious authority, because the sacrament, rather than being something that one receives through the church, sacrament is something that one partakes of every night, for example, when one goes to sleep. Or another Corbett book, Psychotherapy as a Spiritual Practice. If you engage in psychotherapy from that perspective, and if your therapist is also coming from that perspective, the psychotherapeutic encounter in and of itself can become sacramental. Right? So nature, life, world, lived experience becomes sacramental itself. It's a deinstitutionalization of the term. Similar with the notion of salvation. If you remember that wonderful definition and example from William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about these saving experiences that come upon a person when they feel like their whole life has gone to a wreck, or gone into a wreck, or gone to pieces. Salvation for William James becomes interiorized. It's something that comes from within, from the mystery, from the more, from the power greater than oneself. Salvation comes from within, a connection to that source, not necessarily from without, which is very it's very postmodern, it's very American, it's very much in line with the sort of spiritual but not religious type of thinking that we've been discussing throughout the course. And of course, notions of sin and redemption. We could reread or reinterpret Edinger's life cycle of the psyche from ego and archetype along what he does with inflation and humility, the sort of life cycle of the psyche. We could look at that entire spectrum through the lens of sin and redemption, or reconciliation and healing, or sin and return. Right. So sin as a moving away, sin as separation, sin as missing the mark, which is what the term translates to from the Greek. Hamartia, to miss the mark. And then redemption is to come back in alignment. Very psychological. That's a very, we can make that translation from theology to psychology. And then, of course, spirit and soul. And Hillman gives us, for better or for worse, Hillman gives us a great example of translating these very potent terms away from the world of theology, even away from the world of Christianity, and sort of reclaiming them from this very internal, psychologized, deliteralized depth psychological space. Right. So it's a question of translation. It's a hermeneutic work to interpret theology as psychology, or depth psychology. One of my personal favorite readings for this module, but also for this course, is this really short essay from Anne Ulanov on Jung and prayer. She's one of the few people to really talk about this topic, but I think it's very important. Anne Ulanov, for a very long time, I believe decades of her career, she held a chair in psychology and religion at Union Theological Seminary in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So she was teaching Jungian psychology in a seminary environment. So she has had a very, very rare, extraordinary opportunity and perspective to do this psychology, theology type work in a very lived, daily, professional way, working with students, training divinity students, training people to become ministers. So she's one of the few people that was really doing this work at the public or institutional or academic level. So what do we do with prayer? Prayer is typically something that's, for a lot of people, it's very uncomfortable or very off limits, or it's very triggering. But for Ulanov, prayer is central to this conversation. Just as she's a very powerful quote here. Prayer is to religious life what dreaming is to psychic life, experience at the source. So in other words, it's engagement, it's a direct engagement with the numinous. Prayer opens up a psychological and religious reality to us. When we pray, we give over, we invoke, we surrender our ego control and enter into conversation with a power greater than ourselves. So if we take the reality of the psyche seriously, how do we communicate with this immense mystery? We can do dream work. I think certainly the psychedelic conversation and the plant medicine conversation comes in here, psychotherapy. But what about prayer? Is prayer this, as she writes in this book with her former husband who died, I think, in the late 20th century. If prayer is primary speech, is it this sort of primal response to life? What is the role of prayer in a depth psychological capacity? And just briefly, one response to that, or more contemporary response, is my former colleague, who's now an emeritus professor in the mythological studies program, Patrick Mahaffey, wrote a recent book called Integrative Spirituality, where he puts forth this notion of imaginal prayer, which takes Jung's notion of active imagination, but makes it a little more intentional, numinous, connected to the divine. And I think it's a very powerful way to reframe and look at Jung's Red Book as a form of prayer, as a form of dialogue with the mystery, as a form of intimate primary speech with the power greater than ourselves. Hillman does his own rewriting of this in one of his early books called In Search, which is his take on the psychology religion dialogue. And Hillman talks about psychological faith, and that's another word that oftentimes can be very triggering or off limits in today's kind of spiritual but not religious culture. But for Hillman, faith is essential to this conversation as well. But for him, it's a question of faith in what? And for him, it's a question of faith in the psyche, because there's still a leap that happens. There is, I think, a reality of psychological faith that we have to trust if we want to believe that, as Jung says, that the psyche is a self-organizing principle. That in and of itself is a power greater than ourselves, a power greater than our egos, that's outside of our control, that does necessitate an act of faith, a leap of trust in a certain sense. And I think what it becomes for today's postmodern contemporary spiritual seekers, it becomes a form of secular religiosity. And I think it can be potentially very healing for folks, especially those that are recovering from institutional or very traditional forms of religious upbringing, or even potentially spiritual or religious abuse. So we turn to our question for this week, oriented around Jung, psychology-theology dialogue, friendship with Victor White, readings from Victor White. This dialogue also being continued by several influential post-Jungians, for example, Ulanov and Lionel Corbett. Each demonstrate a depth psychological rethinking of traditional religious themes. So how does this translate? Does this translation work for you? Does depth psychology provide a workable contemporary language to engage with traditional theological notions of the sacred? Okay, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with this week.